All right. It is all yours, Mary Kate.
Thank you, ma'am. All right. So, hello, everybody. I'm so delighted that you're here. I see some familiar faces. Thank you so much for coming. I am really excited to share this with you, and I want to tell you a little story about this particular presentation. I was asked by a Caron family group that's local if I would speak to them, if I would come and talk. And I put together a presentation, and it was, a little more basic. And I showed it to the person who runs the group, and she wrote back and said, "Oh no, you can't do this." These are folks who have been dealing with this for a really long time, and this is very basic information, and it's actually just going to be very frustrating or, not at all helpful at the very least. So I really dug in and came back with this presentation in an effort to better meet the needs of the folks that were in that group. And so I hope that you find that there's something useful here, and especially if you've been dealing with this for a long time. So the idea of this presentation is like I'm dealing with addiction. Often when we sort of first have our loved ones get into treatment, we may think, well, oh, I was talking to somebody, can't remember who it was, and they were like, oh, a year. This will be about a year, right? And we know that that's not how recovery works for us or for our loved ones. So we want to look at in the long term, how do I really lean into my own recovery in this experience? So what can help if I'm dealing with long-term chronic substance use disorder and or mental health issues? Maybe my loved one is clean and sober. Maybe they're not. Maybe they are for a portion of time, and then maybe they're not again. Um, or even if they are, how do I deal with my own anxiety around it? So I may already understand at least the concept around setting boundaries. I get pressure from others that I just need to set better limits, kick them out, use tough love. I may even get this pressure from addiction professionals. The anxiety is always there. Sometimes it's quieter, sometimes it's louder. How do I deal with the anxiety in a way that takes as good care of me as I possibly can? How do I deal with the anxiety in a way that takes as good care of my loved one as I possibly can without me feeling like I'm completely being taken down? And what can I learn about anxiety and how I live with it instead of having it sort of run my life? So I always like to talk about this concept of the intergenerational patterns that we all experience because we are all these humans that come from a system and then create our own systems later on. If I look at a genogram, even for 3 generations, I start to see how anxiety and coping has flowed through the system, right? Anxiety is a part of life. If you want to get really existential about it, you could say, oh, well, we all know we're not here forever. There's an inherent anxiety in that, right? There's always a way in which we might lose something. And then when we're dealing with addiction, we are losing things where there's a lot of grief that's involved in that, even when sobriety happens. And so this notion of anxiety being the energy that is passed from one person to another in a system, right? So that is a portion, like love flows through systems, right? Care, contentment flows through systems, but so does anxiety. And it's a part of life. And all of us, everybody in our genogram, everybody above us, everybody that will come after us, we put one foot in front of the other and we adapt to systems. Our nervous system adapts, our brain, our thoughts adapt, our emotional system adapts, our identity adapts because of the systems that we come from, right? Especially in the first 7 years of our lives, we're kind of just downloading the programming, right? It's not like we have that critical thinking online that says, hey, my mom has this experience where, she feels a deep depression and she stays in bed. I don't know that that is really ideal or healthy. And I'm sure it has nothing to do with me, right? It has nothing to do with me. It's not it's not me. Kids always are going to think something has something to do with them because it's an effort to feel some control in the family system. So just understanding that we get wired up, what wires together is a neuroscience statement. So the way our nervous system reacts, the way we develop our stories about the world, about other people, about us, about love, about intimacy, about connection, about safety, all of that gets developed early on when we're not even in a position to kind of pick and choose. And some of the things that we learn are wonderful in our early relationships. And nobody learns everything wonderful. It's always going to be a mixed bag because, again, anxiety is a part of life. So, the bottom line is we become who we are in attachment relationships. And so, I'm never going to take away anybody's upset with parents around what they did or didn't get ever. I'm here for that. That's a part of healing. And as parents ourselves, this experience of just there's a certain humbleness of just seeing this whole genogram system and saying like, oh, we're all these tender humans, trying to adapt, trying to get our needs met. All right. So this is one of my favorite visual references that I use with clients all the time, because in any family system where there is strife or conflict or pain, or essentially bottom line that the anxiety is flowing through that system and there aren't any good circuit breakers, so that anxiety is very, very powerful and kind of governs the system. The temptation, the instinctual way to view that is to look around at the other people who are doing things that feel harmful and say, until they stop, everything's going to be awful. Until they stop. And this doesn't even have to necessarily be the problem in your family. This just could be other people in your family, right? Often as parents, especially if we're dealing with addiction, or just parenting in general, right? We tend to say like, oh, we have different styles, right? Like we can't kind of get on the same page. It's a very common experience in a system. So if you're experiencing that, you're not alone, right? There's certain reasons that systems do that. But our human inclination is to focus on the other people, especially if it's somebody that's doing something that feels destructive, and to say, until they stop doing that, we have to live this way. There's nothing that we can do. And what I want you to know, and this is so critical, is that doesn't have to be the case. And I'm not going to like be some motivational speaker and say like, you can have a wonderful life, even if your loved one is, doing terrible things to themselves and others, specifically to do with addiction or anything else. But rather, I want to encourage agency in folks and love at the same time. So that notion of differentiating, seeing where I stop and start, seeing where the other people stop and start is so darn important. So for instance, even if we're not talking about addiction, if I say my husband and my daughter, they fight a lot, and my husband is an adult, she's a teen, he should know better. If he would just stop doing that, and until he stops, I'm going to have to intervene. I'm going to have to say something. It drives me crazy, but I have to do it. My wife is so negative all the time. I'm always having to remind her of what's positive. I don't know why she's so negative. My brother is the black sheep of the family. He doesn't like any of us. We don't talk to him anymore. My kids never do what I ask them. Everything feels out of control, right? So I love to use the example of the lady in pink that has the rope around her belly. And so you can imagine that anytime the guy in red or the guy in blue or kind of anybody else in the system, because they're all connected, if they get scared, they get triggered for some reason and they pull that rope, she's going to hurt, right? It hurts her stomach. And she's going to turn to them and she's going to say, stop pulling the rope. I've told you 1,000 times. When you do that, it hurts my stomach. And they might even say, I'm so sorry. I know I shouldn't hurt your stomach. Or they might say, I'm not hurting your stomach. What's wrong with you? I'm not pulling the rope. You just think I am, right? So ultimately, she keeps trying to get these other people to stop doing what they're doing so it doesn't hurt her stomach. What we want to help you do is the emotional equivalent, the mental equivalent, the relational equivalent of how does she take that rope off of her stomach and hold on to it. She's still in the system, but now she gets to adjust without her stomach getting hurt. She has more agency. She has more control over her own pain and her own experience in the system. So the bottom line is, oh, and then this is the other exciting part. Sometimes I think what we hear when we hear detachment or we hear don't enable or any of these words that can feel, again, for some people, they can feel kind of shaming, just like, oh, I know I have to be better at that. But what we think often is like separation, cut off, right? Disconnect. I have to just emotionally cut off from that person because they're not changing and I am. But the truth is, in a system, and you can imagine it by just looking at this rope, if I change how I'm holding the rope and I'm holding it differently, everybody else's experience changes. It's just kind of laws of physics, right? And I love to use the metaphor of a stream that's flowing. And if I move a rock in the water, the stream will flow differently, right? I don't know how, I can't control how it's going to flow, but it necessarily will flow differently. And the same is true for us in our family system. And I can't tell you how many people that I've worked with that when they shift how they are upholding the system unintentionally often, they find that the system changes in some healthier direction. So we have tremendous influence on our system. We have zero control on the other people over their choices, but we have so much more power than we realize sometimes in terms of the choices that we make and how we hold the rope. So this notion of self-differentiation, again, there's nothing more important than you can do for your loved one who's in recovery and for your whole family system than to focus on yourself, to focus on with curiosity and deep compassion on how you participate in the system. So to be more clear about that, how you hold the rope gives you more choices, opens everything up, makes everything again, invites it in others. And don't forget, when there's less differentiation, when I am deeply sort of like with the rope around my stomach, and every time they pull, I go. If they have a bad day, I have a bad day. If they have a good day, then I feel some relief, but I'm still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Remember that anxiety will govern that system. We have to figure out how to put the circuit breakers in place and help you get that rope off your stomach. So this is one concept that can help towards differentiation, and it's not a common way, I think, that we look at relationships. This notion of a 50-50 relationship, and am I pulling my weight in the relationship, and are they pulling their weight? And while there's absolutely an appropriate element of that in relationships, it's also really useful to think about 100% relationships. So we looked at that genogram. I adapt to the system that I grew up in. However I do, I adapt to that system. I learn those lessons. I wire up. I go out into the world and I find a partner who feels familiar. Maybe they feel familiar in a way where I say, oh, they're so different than what I had. I never want that again. But it's still very much informed by experience. So there's some kind of familiarity. There's a certain degree of safety. And to some degree, and I'm going to talk about this in more detail in a bit, our nervous systems, the vagus nerve that leads up into the brain, into the limbic system, the emotional centers, those are like our first responders. So often the choices that we're making about who feels good to be around, who feels safe, who feels enjoyable, who feels understandable, is often from that place, right? That's like that's our guiding radar often. So we come into relationship, then we create a system, and the system often gets created in those early days where we run into conflicts, right? Whatever that might be. It doesn't have to be a big fight, but how do we resolve conflict? How do we deal with anxiety? How do we deal with anxiety, right? And so does it fit? Well, it fits. And so, we create our system. So We come from systems, we create systems, and we come into every single interaction with our partner, even if we've been together for 50 years, with our own autonomic nervous system, our own core beliefs, right? Like that we learned about people and intimacy and connection and trust, our own reactivity patterns, and those are neurological patterns, right? It's not just like we're making it up, like we really truly are, have some worn pathways. We're coming into every experience with all of that. So this notion of when I work with families or when I work with couples or anything relational, there's no good guy, no bad guy. And more importantly, there's no better guy and no worse guy. And that is a strange perspective. And I'll often tell the families, you can think there's a good guy and a bad guy. It's okay with me. I'm not telling you how to think, but that's how I'm going to hold this system because it really is more of this. It's not that she started it and she did this thing to him, and now he's mad because she did this thing to him. It's actually so much more layered and complex than that because she came into the experience and he came into the experience with our stories and our nervous systems. And we brought this whole host of ourselves to how we're going to conceive and view the world. And I know we've all had those experiences where we'll say something to someone and they'll hear something so much different than we meant it, right? We'll say something, that's a nuanced statement and it will trigger them and it becomes black and white. And we've just told them, I'm leaving you. I'm leaving you, right? Oh, I didn't say I was leaving you. I just said I'd like you to speak differently to me, right? But that is not an uncommon experience. So what's so powerful about this is that differentiation. This is that I'm going to lean into putting my energy and my efforts in my own recovery into that which I have control over, which is me. But I'm not going to lean into it in a controlling, shaming, like being hard on myself way. I'm going to into it with as much compassion as I can muster because I recognize that there's so much that goes on in me that isn't right up here in the prefrontal cortex. It isn't just like my thinking. I don't have to defend myself. I just need to be curious. I just need to be curious and open and willing to learn. And of course, that sounds great on paper. It's not always easy to do. So I'm going to talk about the polyvagal theory and the vagus nerve. And this is just a part of obviously what goes on inside of the amazing nervous systems and brains of all of us. But this is a really key piece, and it's very well known right now. You probably have heard of it. But I think it's so darn useful, and it helps me, and I think it helps other people that I talk to about it, have some compassion for themselves because of the way we work. It is not all up here in the prefrontal cortex where we're making sense of the world, where we're having thoughts, where we're, cognitive. There's so much more that goes on for us. So our autonomic nervous system is comprised of the neurological structures that operate without conscious intent. Okay. They operate without our thought. We don't control them that way, or they don't actually take action that way. We certainly can become conscious of this and be more thoughtful and connected and have more choice. However, this is just how humans operate. And they've been operating that way since the beginning. And it's really interesting because the vagus nerve and the whole nervous system in terms of reactivity, in terms of how we interact with other humans, and then the internal state has developed over the hundreds of millions of years, right? And so we have some newer pieces, this component here where I'm really able to, have a much more nuanced understanding, be strategic, be thoughtful. I like to, I'm going to do it one of these days. I like to kid around with the group at Encore that I'm going to get t-shirts that say hashtag emotional ninja because that's, where we have the most strategy and thoughtfulness and we can bring that to our relationships. However, this other piece is there. So anyway, It's been a long time in the making to get where we are today. The sympathetic nervous system is the part of our nervous system that says, okay, maybe there's a problem here, right? And it's going to activate me and to get ready to do something. And the parasympathetic part of my nervous system is going to slow it down and relax me, and I can come back into what we call a window of tolerance. So I want to talk about the vagus nerve in particular. It's one of our most important nerves in our autonomic nervous system for emotional regulation and self-differentiation. And the vagus actually means in Latin the wanderer. And the vagus nerve travels from our brainstem, I believe it's the 10th cranial nerve, all the way down. It's connected into our eyes and our ears. It's connected to our stomachs and our intestines and even our spleen. So this is that nerve that is constantly scanning and asking the basic question, am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? And I think of it like a periscope or a radar screen that is just constantly neurocepting. And it's neurocepting on the inside, like my thoughts, how my body feels, but it's also neurocepting on the outside. So when my husband says to me, honey, but he says it with that tone that he gets sometimes, right? That's my nervous system, my vagus nerve is like, what's going on? Something's happening. And all that happens before I'm even consciously aware of it. So the polyvagal theory is from a fellow named Stephen Porges, who was a researcher, and it proposes that the evolution of the mammalian autonomic nervous system, so remember we said it evolved, right, over time, that, initially it was just that reactivity, right, just like, I gotta go hide because the mastodon is coming or whatever, right? And then we move into a place where we're taking action. I'm going to kill the mastodon. And then we move into this place that's more thoughtful. So it provides the neurophysiological substrates for adaptive behavioral strategies. In other words, that's from the National Institutes of Health. This is the way I experience the world. And this is the way that I'm constantly, just like I'm breathing, just like my heart is beating, this is happening without my thought, where I'm constantly scanning. And then how do I deal with it when something starts to feel unsafe? These slides are from a wonderful flip chart by Deb Dana, who is the leading polyvagal therapy practitioner. And so these are pulled directly from her flip chart, just to make sure to give her credit. So the bottom line is, remember I said we wire up for 7 years, we're starting to wire up. We keep wiring up our whole lives. Good news is neuroplasticity is a thing. And when we're making changes in our recovery, we literally are rerouting our thinking processes, our emotional processes, that vagus nerve, how the reactivity patterns are. The thing is that we build our stories about the world. And I love to use the word story when I'm doing relational therapy, because it's not to say that it's a story like I made it all up and it's not based on any reality. My story in my marriage might be dead on, but it is still my thinking. Just that simple. Like, this is the story I have about what's happening, but also more importantly, this is the story I have about what I think might happen. Right? How many of my decisions am I making because of what I think might happen? And so I'm deciding from that place. So it's really so powerful, again, to be able to say, I have a story, right? I have a nervous system. I'm this whole independent 100% human over here, and I get to work with that. So state creates story. So that's really useful. Again, there's some of the literature that'll say things like states become traits, right? So if I'm a kiddo who is experiencing a lot of neglect, that state of neglect, whatever happens for me neurologically, mentally, and emotionally, there's a chronicness to it that becomes, I'm wired up that way, right? It's not a surprise when I walk into the world with that wiring and have certain experiences. So there's 3 essential elements in terms of this question of, am I safe? Am I safe? And they are context, choice, and connection. And all that means is, context means, do I get what's happening here sufficiently to feel safe enough? Or do I feel like I don't understand what's going on? Does it feel so crazy? And it's so interesting because what I find with family members, husbands, wives, people with children, adult children, so often in our support groups, what we're doing is we're saying, can you believe this? This is crazy. This behavior is crazy. It doesn't make any sense. And we're putting a lot of energy in trying to understand this behavior. Why is this happening? And that's one of the reasons that it can feel so incredibly activating to the nervous system because it doesn't make sense to us. Now, we will talk later about the fact that all behaviors make sense, but they definitely don't make sense looking at it from the outside in. Choice. Do I have a choice? And, you know, do I have a choice in this situation? Do I see myself as having a choice? Or do I feel like it's an impossible situation that I don't have any choice in the matter? And again, we have to look at like, what does that mean? What does that mean about having a choice? And connection, this connection with the other human being feels safe in this situation. So those are the questions that this system is always sort of evaluating. And these are just the organizing principles of the theory. Number one, co-regulation, meaning with other human beings, is a biological imperative. Co-regulation is a biological imperative. We are not just, prefrontal cortex thinking humans. We have this whole nervous system. And the idea of connection where we have context and choice and safety, that is how we can often learn healthier regulation is in relationship with other people. Neuroception, this detection without awareness, that's a fundamental principle of this idea. And hierarchy simply means, remember I said we evolved over time. So the dorsal vagus nerve and that's the lower down in the body nerve, the sympathetic and the ventral vagal is kind of like a ladder. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, in terms of where I'm at on the ladder. So the idea is that for all of us as humans, there's a drive to survive and a longing to connect. And there's that tension that's there. And it doesn't have to feel like tension, right? But there is these two drives. And so, people these days talk a lot about anxious attachment and avoidant attachment. And, pretty historically, you're going to see somebody with anxious attachment get together with somebody that's avoidant for all sorts of reasons, right? But that's this pull. That's just this sort of organic pull. Like, I want to be close, but does it feel good to be close? And when it does feel good, and often it's really interesting, it's through the prosody of somebody's voice and through the facial expressions, the tone of their voice. Like I was saying earlier, if my husband says honey, but it has a certain tone to it, right? I like to say we have a PhD in one another. We're very aware. So if that's going okay, then we're co-regulating, right? And we're inviting new possibilities. And that's why one of the things when we talk about our power is like, if we stay calm, if we work on this and we keep differentiating, then we invite that calmness. We're inviting co-regulation. Doesn't mean the other person's going to be able to do that, but that's the piece where we have power. Or if we're not feeling safe based on all these cues that our nervous systems are picking up from each other, then we start to get reactive and it reinforces habitual survival patterns. We all know about what my husband and I call fight number 42, which is like, we know our opinions on it. We've both given our detailed reasons why our perspective is what it is, but it doesn't resolve. And that's what we call that habitual pattern. That's really kind of not about the content, but more about the underlying safety. So when things are good, when there's a neuroceptive match, it feels good, it seems good, we're good. But then when there's a neuroceptive mismatch, we feel activated. We're in that sympathetic nervous system. We want to state our case. So often I find that what couples are saying to each other feels to them like they're saying, I'm not wrong. I want you to understand my pain. I want you to see my perspective, why I feel the way that I do. And it's coming out as you're wrong, right? But And so that's where we are when we're in conflict with anyone, is we're having this neuroceptive mismatch. And we're not feeling that we're in our what we call our ventral vagal. We're definitely activated. And in some couples, some people maybe have been in situations where in their first 7 years, in their early years, there was a lot of chaos around them. And their way of being safe was going into the dorsal vagal, where they're just like, they're hiding, right? They're not fighting, they're not fleeing, but they're freezing and they're sort of going down. So this is just a quickie look. We don't have to spend a lot of time here, but that vagus nerve, as I said, runs, comes at the cranial, it's a cranial nerve, and it goes all the way down and it touches all these parts. And one of the things I was sort of tickled to learn is that the trapezius muscle and the sternocleidomastoid muscle, your jaw, are innervated not by spinal nerves like all the other muscles in your body, but by the vagus nerve. And that's why we find our ears up around our shoulders or our shoulders up around our ears, or we clench our jaws because it's autonomic. It's not something that we think about doing, it just happens. Okay. Oh, and I do want to just say this while we're here. Let's see if I can let go of that. Sorry, guys. That the way it works is you're going to get, it's down here doing its job of seeing how things are doing. It sends the message, oh, I think there might be a problem. The heart, sends a message to the heart and it says, heart, you need to work a little faster. Lungs, get ready. There could be something we have to deal with. The message goes up, the biochemical message goes up here. The first place that it's going to hit is what we call the limbic system, which is a different brain structures like the hippocampus and the amygdala, just to name a couple, that are the emotional centers of the brain. And we've all heard about the amygdala. That's another one that you hear a lot about. And they're like, uh-oh, we've got a problem. We got a problem. And then finally, the message comes up here to the farthest place away, which is that prefrontal cortex. Frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex is particularly where we are strategic, where we can parse and understand and have perspective. But that's the last place that the message goes. And I like to joke and say it's kind of a bad design. But again, it's happened, it's evolved over many, 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 many hundreds and thousands of years. All right. So I think this is really kind of interesting. So the vagus nerve cells are 80 to 90% afferent, meaning they send messages up to the brain. 80 to 90% of the activity that comes from this nerve is going to the brain in that pathway that I just talked about. Only 10 to 20 are going down to the body from the brain. So again, this notion of most of our actions start out unconscious, and then finally the message gets up to the prefrontal and we make sense of it. Okay. So this is a quote from this wonderful book. I highly recommend it. If you listen to it on audiobook, it's narrated by the author. So it's this fellow named Dr. Perry, Bruce Perry, who's a neuroscientist, and I believe he's a neuroscientist. He may be a psychiatrist, but he has done tons and tons of research and tons of clinical work, specifically having to do with this notion of we experience the world from the bottom up. So again, 80 to 90% of the messages are going up, only 10 to 20 are coming down. So and they've written a book, it's called What Happened to You. So the notion is, instead of what's wrong with you, why are you doing that? It doesn't make any sense. The notion of we're all understandable in the right context. So what is it that happened that helped to wire you up in such a way that this is how you've coped? This is how you adapted. So this is from a book, or I'm sorry, a PDF that's just a discussion guide from what's a place called Paces Connections. Consider this quote from Dr. Perry: all experience is processed from the bottom up, meaning to get to the top smart part of our brain, we have to go through the lower, not so smart. I don't love that phrasing, but this sequential processing means that the most primitive reactive part of the brain is the first part that interprets and acts on the information coming from our senses. Bottom line, our brain is organized to act and feel before we think. Act and feel before we think. How does our knowledge of this way of processing information help us to better understand the responses of others and also ourselves? So I like to say that to me it feels there's a grace in it, right? Like if I keep showing up with my reactivity, I don't have to be mad at myself. I don't have to be disappointed in myself. How do I create space for that and which will actually diminish diminish some of that reactivity? So here's that autonomic ladder that I talked about, that notion of like, you know, how am I feeling in the world? Am I feeling up at the top of the ladder when I'm in what we call our ventral vagal, literally up here on the nerve? Am I feeling engaged? Like I have choice, context, and connection. Something happens. And again, like in relationships, it's often we'll say like, it was so sudden, right? Like everything was fine. And then it suddenly wasn't because just this one little thing happened, right? And then now we're here like, okay, there could be some problem. And we might not be thinking that again, right? But our body is experiencing that. And almost always, if we go into that sympathetic, that neuroception of danger, we have something called a window of tolerance. That's another really great piece of info. But like in the window of tolerance, I can stay in ventral vagal, right? I might go up and down a little, but I'm pretty much staying there. I'm okay. But if things get too activated and I burst out of that window of tolerance, eventually I'm going down into this dorsal vagal, right? If I have a really big fight or a really intense experience, at some point I'm going to be kind of exhausted by that and need to come back down and balance out. So again, these are just examples of like when I'm in those different states. So I know that I'm in ventral vagal when I feel safe, when I feel co-regulated with the other person, when I feel self-regulated, just meaning I'm able to calm myself, I'm able to settle, I'm able to connect to others, I can acknowledge when I have distress. So I can feel some distress and still be in ventral vagal. I can still be in a relationship and notice that I'm feeling a certain way. I can reach out for or offer support. I feel resourced and resourceful, right? So even if I've got a challenge, I can still stay in that window of tolerance because I feel like, oh, I understand. I understand this. This is the thing that happens for me, and it's okay. I go into sympathetic. I'm mobilizing to survive. I'm moving into fight or flight. I might feel out of sync with other people, might feel not comfortable. Maybe I want to go home. Maybe I want to be alone. I'm feeling driven to get my needs met. And just like spoiler alert, I don't know if that's the right thing to say. This is where we go, people dealing with addiction. This is when we know we're headed, pick up, right? When we're activated. I feel alarmed, anxious, hypervigilant. I misread cues from others. I hear things that they're not exactly saying. I listen for the sounds of danger. I sacrifice social engagement for survival. And then at the bottom of the ladder, when I'm really, really shut down, and we can anticipate that most of our loved ones dealing with addiction have known this experience, but so have we because we're dealing with our loved one's addiction. I might withdraw, I might shut down, I might collapse, become foggy or numb. I might go through the motions without any conscious awareness of what I'm doing. Feel lost, abandoned, invisible, disappear into a state of not knowing, not feeling, or not being. So I mentioned this earlier, but one of the most critical pieces in this whole process is the eyes and the ears, um, and seeing basically being in connection with someone else and getting that information of what their nervous system is telling me, what their facial features, what I'm hearing in their voice, etc. I love this phrase. They're searching for signs of welcome and warning. And just this concept of a vagal brake. So the vagal brake is like the way the biochemical messages are being managed is there's like a break on to some degree. Things are okay. We're kind of steady Eddie, right? But as soon as, remember again, it's more from the bottom up to the brain. As soon as we start to sound the alarm, the brake comes off and things go faster. And so that vagus nerve is going to go up to the brain, and it's the sympathetic cardiac nerves. So they increase the heart rate, increase the breathing, increase maybe the clutching of the jaw or the muscles in your shoulders, etc. And again, we're able to send messages down parasympathetic. And that's why that piece right there is so key for us to feel like we can lean into learning how to tend ourselves when we're in sympathetic. When we start to get anxious, learning, because there's so much out there about anxiety, how do we lean into making a commitment to try to tend ourselves and put that vagal brake back on? So just the bottom line on this one is, to say lots of words here, so my apologies. If we think the problem is out there, then we don't have to deal with it, but we also don't have the power to deal with it. And we must understand that anxiety is a part of life. It's what brings us here tonight, right? It mobilizes us. It makes us say, there's something that I want that I don't have. There's something I'd like to create more of or less of. And so there's real positive to that. We call that eustress instead of distress. However, we get to a point where we hit a point of maximum yield for our distress or eustress, and it becomes distress. And we definitely see this in our family systems that are dealing with addiction. And we see a lot of over functioning on behalf of other people, a lot of trying so hard to, think of all the ways this could go and how can we get this person to stop drinking or stop doing this or see themselves in a more positive light or whatever the thing is. How can we get that? Well, we can't. We can't get that. We have to turn back here to ourselves and invite that. We have to create that in ourselves, tend that in ourselves, again, with as much compassion and curiosity and as little judgment of ourselves and blame of ourselves as possible. And then we invite that in others. And I'll just say this one other thing that I think is really good to know. Have this in your hip pocket. If you're that person that over functions on everybody else's behalf in your family, and you feel like this frustration about that, right? It is so incredibly, from just a behavior modification standpoint, if sometimes your control works and your overfunctioning works, even if it only works like 3 times out of 10, that from a behavior modification standpoint, that intermittent reinforcement is like the most powerful, right? So that sense of it works 3 times, so I'm going to keep on trying it, even though the other 7 times it's a dismal failure. Just know that. Just know that that's gonna, be compelling to keep doing. And again, understanding that in a system where there's unchecked anxiety, too much distress, it's the governor of the system. Okay. Family change, system change, relationship change. Something happens, like the addiction gets pretty bad, right? Treatment becomes imminent, or it's just really bad, period, right? And we have to do something different. So what will happen is we internal systems as well as within the family system, we want something different. We don't like the way it is. We hate it, but it is familiar and it is known. And there are probably aspects of us, again, that are not super conscious that think it has to be this way or it might be something worse. And so we have the opportunity to lean in to the change and trust that other people have leaned in and have found more peace and less distress, and that this is something that's possible for us as well. Or we snap back. The rubber band has been pulled too much, and we try to go back to the way it was before. I hear people all the time saying they want to get back to normal. What is possible for us as a new normal and a way better normal than before. But just know that the system pulls back, both within us and outside of us. But the cool thing is that post-traumatic growth is such a thing. Neuroplasticity and the ability to change my neurological system with different behaviors and different thoughts and different changes I'm making in the relationship system is such a thing. And so really, we're not shooting for, getting back to the way things were before. Ideally, we're shooting for something that's better. So this concept of behaviors always make sense. This is again from the book, Dr. Perry and Oprah Winfrey's book. So on page 23, Dr. Perry explains that seemingly senseless or confusing behavior makes more sense once you look at what's behind the behavior, why they did that. So that notion of what happened to you instead of why are you like that? So what would make them act that way? Something happened that influenced how their brains work. When was the last time that you struggled to understand behavior from someone in your life? What were your reactions to the behavior? Did you get frustrated, annoyed, or angry because their behavior made life harder for you? Or did you consider asking yourself what was behind that behavior? And so I like to say in our family group, you can't throw logic on that grease fire, right? So that's a big part of our suffering is to look at the behavior and say, it just doesn't make sense. Why would they have, 3 months clean and then go back out again? Why would they do that? Things were so much better. There's always a way to understand it if we have all the information, and we don't always have it. But just knowing that can reduce some of my suffering. And I can't stress enough my hashtag emotional system ninja t-shirts that post-traumatic growth and wisdom is a thing. Like that is the silver lining of this experience is that we get to lean in and find our new normal. And again, not to diminish in any way the horribleness of the experience, but to like, what can I find out of it that is of benefit? So post-traumatic wisdom introduces us to these thematic words, the painful path of wisdom. We're taught that resilience is learned over time. It can't be rushed, and it can never be assumed. What mistakes are easy to make in traumatic situations when we don't respect the painful path of wisdom. So this notion of I don't want to continue to just feel like life is washing over me in this awful situation, but I want to say, I'm going to somehow make sense of my life. I'm going to lean into what I can learn here. The painful path of wisdom is dependent on those we meet along the way. So this the other piece is how am I putting myself in places where people can understand my experience, where I can do this with others. I can help to co-regulate with others who understand what this is like. Oprah discusses growing up in her church family provided these connections for her. Her community didn't have a word for the kind of trauma that so many African Americans endured, so they said, we weathered it together. So who are you weathering this path with? Who are you weathering this experience with? Okay. All right. This is from dialectic behavior therapy. This is critical, obviously, for people dealing with addiction, but I like to say that DBT is just good for humans, right? It's just good information and good thoughts. And this is just a view of that notion of the nervous system in terms of I've got my emotional nervous system, my neurological, emotional, and then I've got my cognitive. And ideally, I'm not cutting off any of it. Ideally, I'm striking a balance between my rational mind and my emotional mind, and I'm aware, and I'm honoring all of it, right? I'm not rejecting myself. I'm not rejecting my feelings. I'm not rejecting my thoughts. I'm noticing, I'm being with, and then I'm getting to make my strategic choices. There's another one of these that I really like. It's super useful, and it talks about addict mind and clean mind. So clean mind over here on the rational, addict over here on the emotional. And the essence of that is to say, don't forget that addict mind exists in you and in your loved one, because our deep desire is that they would get clean and they would never ever go into addict mind again, right? And remembering that that's there and that's a part of us, and just being conscious of that is really important. I'm going to send Mallory, I have a big old list that goes along with this of links for all these different kinds of things. Um, and this is, I make the distinction on this slide of sometimes I'm going to use mindfulness and tuning into my internal systems to support safety, because maybe I am flooded, I am in I'm in sympathetic nervous system, and no thank you. Like I just need to get back into my window of tolerance before I can do anything else. So this is a list up at the top of what can I do when I'm in that spot. So one thing I want to encourage you to do is go out to Google and to YouTube and look at exercises for vagal toning. That's really cool. There's some really neat things. I'll show you one. It's super simple. You're going to just turn your head to the left, back to the center, and then to the right. And what you're doing there, you've got that cranial nerve, the vagus nerve in there, and you're just bringing more blood to that nerve. And it can feel settling, right? If it can help you to settle. There's another one that I've learned recently where you put your hands behind your head. Ideally, you're doing it when you're lying down at first, but you can do it standing up and sitting up. And you just look at your 3 o'clock and you hold that until you have a sigh or a yawn or a swallow. And that is resetting to that nervous system as well. I put here nervous system ninja because ironically, there's that's a YouTube channel that's really wonderful that has those types of things. Square breathing is breathing where you're creating a square. So if I breathe in for 5, I hold it for 5, I breathe out for 5, and I hold that for 5. And the holding times are when the carbon dioxide and the oxygen equalize in my body, which is very toning for the vagal system. Calling someone who understands, who will listen. Again, who are you weathering with, right? So do you go to Al-Anon? Is there some other place where you are not alone in your experience of having addiction recovery in your family or lack of recovery in your family? Who are you weathering with, and who could you call and just say, I just really need to release this energy, and I just need a listen. A lot of folks in our family group love to garden, dancing, and maybe you're dancing to something really fast and really loud, or maybe you're dancing in some other way. Listening to a meditation that feels safe and settles your nervous system. I have one here in the presentation today. I don't think I'm going to do it, but I'm going to send it to you. And it's about being a mountain. And it's about this notion of the mountain just is always there through all the seasons and all the weathers. The mountain is just there. And so that's a piece that can be helpful to us as we differentiate and we get clear about that. I'm here. I'm always here, regardless of what goes on. Tip skills are DBT, dialectical behavior therapy skills, that have to do with temperature, intense exercise, paced belly breathing, and progressive relaxation. So that's what TIP stands for. But putting ice in your hands, putting ice in a bowl with water and putting your face in it, if you're feeling really dysregulated, these are 2 things that can really shift the nervous system. So that's kind of an interesting thing to be aware of. If I just feel like I can't stop worrying, I can't stop thinking, I'm fretting, that's kind of a cool way to do that. Some kind of intense exercise, if that's your jam. Paced belly breathing, again, just, I'm breathing in and I'm breathing out and I'm trying to do it in that square breathing way, can be great. And then progressive relaxation, and that's another one you can Google. It's just a meditation often that's or just taking yourself through I'm going to squeeze my hands really tight and then I'm going to let them go. And I'm going to squeeze my arms and let that go. Those are just some examples. Pranayama is yoga breathing. So there are all sorts of cool, again, that's another one. If you head out to YouTube, or if you find a great yoga class that teaches it, you can have a whole 1 hour class in just breathing. And there's some wonderful, they'll call them postures that you have in yoga. One of my favorite is called bee breath, and I won't show you the full bee breath, but if you just plug your ears and then you hum, close your eyes and just hum, um, it can feel difficult to think when you're doing it. So it's a great way to sort of interrupt that, the way the thoughts are sort of firing through. And there's a practice that I'm going to send out called the daily practice. It has been developed by a woman who calls herself the crappy childhood fairy. And it has to do with, she likens it to clearing the windshield of wet leaves when you need to get on with your day. She calls it the daily practice because it's something that she did every morning and every night when she was in a tremendous amount of emotional strife and processing. And it was a way for her to kind of clear the pipes. And I'll send that out and feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions about it. But sometimes what we want to do in our healing process and our leaning in is we want to actually use the anxiety, right? We want to be curious about it because we're trying to learn how to tolerate the feeling of it and get through it, right? So often with anxiety, we just instinctively try to, go away from it or let it get bigger and bigger because we give it a lot of power and a lot of control because that's how humans work, right? That's how systems work. So being able to consciously lean in, we want to try to get through the arc of anxiety in a situation where we're making a change. Okay. So DBT practices, again, that's something you could go out and Google, or you could um, go to YouTube. There's so much good information about dialectical behavior therapy, and in particular, building distress tolerance, right? How do I, in a healthy way, learn how to tolerate the distress in a healthy way? I love internal family systems as a therapeutic modality. There's a really wonderful book called Self Therapy by Jay Early that talks about ways that you can meet your internal states, that anxiety, whatever it is, and work with that yourself. It's also probably best done initially with a therapist, but you could try it yourself as well. And so that's a really good book for that. The book I mentioned before, What Happened to You by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. The woman that did the polyvagal slides that I showed you, the flip chart, Deb Dana, she has wonderful books, lots of great information on the web, and polyvagal cards, which I think I have here. I do not, but they are these wonderful daily cards that deal with the questions and meditations, things to consider around the vagal system. Janine Fisher is another person that has wonderful books about this stuff. Journaling, drawing, listening to a meditation that connects you to your discomfort. So the mountain meditation helps me get connected, it helps me settle in, but maybe I might listen to a guided meditation that asks me some questions to explore my anxiety a little bit, to be with it, to learn about it a little bit. And of course, I'm going to say working with a therapist who understands addiction or chronic mental health issues in a family system and who you trust. Those are probably, that's a very powerful and important thing to do in your own recovery. I put a link up here. Again, I'll send all this out, but the family program in Encore has a Pinterest board that we're always pinning cool things to, having to do with all of this stuff. So I highly recommend it. I also want to recommend, I'll send this out, there's a YouTube channel that I just adore called Put the Shovel Down, or Put Down the Shovel, Put the Shovel Down. It's a woman and her staff in South Carolina. So she's got the great South Carolina accent, who's very knowledgeable about addiction and family systems, and but is able to present the information in a way that can sometimes just feel a little lighter and easier to take in. All right, so this is our meditation that we're not going to do. And I just want to sort of wrap up by saying, again, just reiterating that I want you to take heart and know that your strongest power lies in your relationship with yourself, in your family system. So, learning about your own relationship to your own anxiety, learning about the internal sort of flow of how you work, doing these things that are focused on that bottom up work as opposed to just how we think about it. Um, and doing it, as I said, I can't stress this enough. If there was one thing, if I had a magic wand and I could work with anyone, with that wand, and I could just do one thing with them, it would be to fill you up with as much self-compassion as possible. Because the root of so much of the suffering and what they call the second arrow is when I recognize that I'm doing things in my system that are upholding the problems, I can so often be blaming of myself. That second arrow hits me. And so, how can I make space for myself to be exactly how I am today and still working towards more health and better choices and do it with compassion and curiosity? And that is it.